Hey YouTube, today I wanted to talk a little bit about the EGR valve, why it's there, how it works, and basically what does it do, right? So the EGR valve is exhaust gas recirculation, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to take the hot exhaust from the exhaust system. We're going to run it through this valve into the intake manifold. So we're going to put exhaust gases into the exhaust manifold. Now, the reason why we do that is because the exhaust gas, if the engine is running correctly, the exhaust should not have any oxygen left in it and should not have any fuel left in it. Right? If we have a good combustion, if the car is lean, right, then we ran out of fuel before we ran out of air. If the car is rich, we ran out of air before we ran out of fuel. If the combustion is correct, we run out of both air and fuel at the same time. Now, if that's the case, then when we put exhaust gases into this intake manifold, that gas is inert gas, which means it will not burn. It has no fuel, it has no air. So why would we do that? Well, the idea behind that is to take up space in the combustion chamber. So in normal combustion, intake valve opens, the piston then comes down, pulls the air and the fuel in there, 14.7 to 1, right? Piston comes back up, the valve closes, squeezes the fuel. As it squeezes the fuel, we light the fuel. Under a perfect scenario, we burn all the fuel. Now, at some point, our cylinder temperatures become very hot, over 2,500 degrees. At 2,500 degrees, we then form what's known as NOx. Right? NOx is not good for the environment, so what we're going to try to do is we're going to cool the combustion chambers. Well, how do I cool the combustion chambers? I put this inert exhaust gas in there. Right? Once again, if it doesn't have any air left and it doesn't have any fuel left, then it's not going to burn. So now, when I open that intake valve and I pull that piston down, not only is it putting 14.7 to 1 air-fuel ratio, but it's also pulling that exhaust gas. Now, I have this chamber that's filled with partially inert gas that won't burn, partially fuel and air. Now as I squeeze it, I light it off, what happens? Well, I still get combustion, but I don't have the same temperature that I did if I was pulled in straight air and fuel. So it will cool the combustion temperatures. By cooling the combustion temperatures, I lower NOx. Now, let's talk a little bit about the way it works. So I have vacuum that comes out of my one throttle body, goes to this sensor. This sensor either then bleeds off the vacuum or it allows vacuum here. Right? So the vacuum comes in, it sits here and it waits for this solenoid to open. When this solenoid opens, then it applies vacuum to here. As it does, it pulls up this diaphragm on the bottom. That allows the exhaust gases to get into the intake manifold to mix with the fuel and the air. Now, the only time this valve should ever open is during part throttle, or what's known as cruise. If for some reason this solenoid opens at idle, that's going to upset the engine and it's going to let the car stall, because there's not enough fuel going into the combustion chambers to burn. If I open this during wide open throttle, then I make no power, because at wide open throttle I want all the fuel in the air to get into those cylinders. So the only time I open this EGR valve is during cruise or part throttle. At that point, it won't upset the engine, and it won't rob horsepower, needed horsepower that we need. Right? So that's the idea behind the EGR valve. Now, one of the easiest ways to check the EGR valve is if you're running the car and you put your fingers below this valve and you just pull up on this diaphragm. When you pull it up, the engine should start to shake, and that's because you're upsetting the fuel mixture of the amount of air and fuel going into the combustion chamber. So if you think the EGR valve is acting up, there's a couple of reasons that could cause it. One, this diaphragm is hanging up. And if it's hanging up, then you're going to have a rough idling at idle, possibly a stalling condition. Or two, you think a lack of power at full throttle. And if that's the case, once again, that diaphragm is hanging up, and it's allowing that exhaust gas into the combustion chamber when it's not supposed to be there. As we said before, the only time that that's supposed to be in there is during cruise or part throttle. And that's because we really don't need power at that point. Idle, there's not enough fuel and air going into the combustion chamber, and so it gets it unstable. What you can do if you suspect that, you can take these two bolts out, put a block-off plate on there, and see if that straightens out your idle. You can also pull that vacuum line off, and if it straightens out when you pull the vacuum line off, that means your solenoid is acting up. Now, it might just be on the original. In '84, there was a piece of foam right here, and that's a vent. So when that thing shuts off, that vacuum's supposed to vent back out to here. Now, they've been known to get clogged and do other things. So even though the solenoid shut off, this still has vacuum going to it. So if that's the case, then by pulling that vacuum line, that should fix that. If it's not, and it's actually the pintle that's stuck up in the position, you pull these two bolts off, put a block-off plate on there, then if that's the case, then that should straighten it out. But so like I said, the only time it should be on is cruise, right? It doesn't change the air-fuel ratio. The air-fuel ratio is 14.7 to 1 stoichiometric, and if it's 12 to 1, rich, trying to make power, then if it's under those two circumstances, then it doesn't really matter. All you're doing is taking up space inside the combustion chamber, right? You're not changing the fuel ratio at all. And if you had 14.7 to 1 and it took up this much room, and then you opened up the EGR and 14.7 to 1 only took this much room, but the inert gas filled the rest, doesn't change your fuel ratio. It changes the amount of space or the amount of fuel and air that's inside that. It doesn't make it lean and it doesn't make it rich, and the reason for that is it's inert gas. There's no fuel and there's no air left in your exhaust system on a perfect combustion. Right? So that's my little scenario for the EGR. I hope you liked it. I hope it gives you a better idea of how to diagnose it and what it's there for. All right. Like I said, the only time the reason why it's there, it doesn't work cold. That's another thing, right? It only works when the engine's warmed up, because The only thing you're trying to do is reduce NOx. NOx is built over 2,500 degrees. So if your engine's cold, your combustion chambers aren't going to be 2,500 degrees, therefore the EGR shouldn't come on. So it should only come on hot, it should only come on cruise. Alright, thanks you two. Have a great day.